Hello students and welcome to week 7. Week 7 we're going to be covering chapter 7 in your textbook. The topic is behavioral approaches and the person in need. And so we're going to be going over, for the next couple of chapters, we're going to be going over some of the different strategies that we use in working with within the profession, within human services. And so this chapter 8 and 9 are going to cover some of that as we move towards this kind of like middle section of the semester. And so questions to consider as you're reading through chapter 7. What are the 4 models of learned behavior? How may disordered behavior be learned? What is systematic desensitization? How does the use of a token economy help change behavior? And what is cognitive behavioral therapy? And so the strategies that are covered in this chapter are very common strategies for human service professionals to use, whether it's counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, all of that. These are more evidence-based because they can be manualized. And so one therapist can do exactly the same thing as another therapist because it can be very structured, and then we can assess them and do studies on them. And so there's a lot of evidence supporting the use of these different strategies. And so again, it starts off with a little case study and then does the introduction of the chapter. And so certain common themes can be identified as hallmarks of behaviorally oriented approaches that distinguish them from other theoretical orientations that we're going to learn about. The first is the emphasis on measurable current behavior and its impact on the environment, or the impact of the environment on the measurable behavior. And so I want to stop smoking, and right now I can measure and say, I smoke a certain number of cigarettes a day or a certain number of packs a week, and I have that number to start with. Or I want to go to the gym more, and so I would say, currently I go to the gym twice a week for, an hour at a time. So you have that initial baseline, and then the way behavioral therapy works is you want to increase that or decrease that, right? So in the case of smoking, you'd want to decrease it. Exercise, you might want to increase it. And so you are able to measure the difference and the change. 2, a specific behavior, emotion, or cognition, once identified, might be modified by concrete actions of the person or actions of others that can be clearly or objectively specified. So this might look more like cognitive behavioral therapy, where we recognize that we're engaging in a behavior. We can look back and say, well, I'm engaging in that behavior when I maybe feel a certain way or have a certain experience. And so how can I go back even further and say, what is causing that, so that I can make some changes so that ultimately I don't end up feeling this way and I don't engage in these behaviors I don't want to. And then the third is that it is assumed that changed behavior, emotion, or cognition affects the client's adjustment. And so when I make these changes and I do these things to make these changes happen, there's going to be some kind of consequence to that, some kind of change happening in my environment, or I'm going to feel better about the way things are going in my life, for example. And so the behavioral approaches are primarily based on theories about how people learn, which is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. There are 4 models of learned behavior. And so the classical conditioning model, you may have heard of this before. It's when you pair a neutral stimulus with another stimulus that elicits a response, you're going to get the response from that neutral stimulus. So you may have heard of Pavlov's dogs, right? And so the dogs would salivate when they saw their food being brought to them. And so what they did is every time they brought their food, they would ring a bell. And then the dogs would see the food, they would start to salivate. Well, after a while, the dogs would hear the bell and start to salivate even before they saw the food. And so that is classical conditioning. The second is operant behavioral model. So this comes from Skinner. You may also be aware of his experiment. It's not as well known as Pavlov's, but what Skinner did is had a young child who saw this fuzzy, fluffy white bunny, and every time they presented the bunny to the child, they would make this really loud, harsh sound. And so the child would get upset and start to cry. And so what they started seeing is that even without the bunny there, the child would scream without the loud noise, if the child just saw the bunny, it would start to scream and cry because it started associating the bunny with the loud bell. And so Skinner's experiments, the operant behavior model, is really what people talk about as behavioralism. And so how can we use this to change our behaviors, either increase in frequency, decrease, things like that. So one of the things that happened was a generalization. And so that child that Skinner worked with was not only afraid of the fuzzy white or the furry white bunnies, he also became afraid of, his name, they called him Little Albert. I don't know if that was actually his name. But he also became afraid of Santa Claus's white beard and, a fuzzy white blanket and things like that. And so he generalized that fear of the bunnies because of that loud noise to other things. Next is discrimination, and that's when you work to negate the effects of generalization. So the experiment was deemed unethical and it was ended, and poor little Albert moved on life being afraid of white furry things. But had they had time to work with him, they could have helped the child discriminate between the white furry bunnies and other things that were white and fuzzy or furry, and that would be discrimination. So it would be able to tell, the difference. Your book talks about a fear of dogs, and being able to say, okay, this dog bit me, that dog I'm weary of, but it doesn't mean that other dogs are going to be necessarily bad. Next is punishment. That is when we have a behavior by, say, a child, and there's some kind of consequence that's put out there. So like the parent might put the child in a timeout or tell them they're not allowed to, play their video game anymore or something like that. Next is positive reinforcement, which is something that increases the behavior. So if the child is having a temper tantrum and they get their parents' attention, which is what they want, they're going to temper tantrum more. But if they don't get it, then they won't. So positive reinforcement isn't necessarily something that's helpful. It just means we're adding something. So the child's throwing a temper tantrum, we're giving the child attention, it means that they're going to have more tantrums, right? You can do this for positive things as well, like a child, you notice the child is, reading really well, or doing what they're supposed to do. You could say, hey, I'm going to reward you by giving you this piece of candy or something like that. The withdrawal of positive reinforcement is when you take away something. So, if a child is misbehaving, you take away their toy, you take away their video game, like I said. Negative reinforcement is when you so you're basically taking away something negative in order to help them to continue that behavior. So the example they give in the book is the child picks up their clothes, the parent stops nagging, right? Like, if you do your homework, I'm going to stop nagging you, you're going to feel better about it. You're going to pick up your clothes more often because you don't feel like hearing me nag. So that's negative reinforcement. Negative meaning you're taking something away. And so positive reinforcement sounds like something good's happening, and negative reinforcement sounds like something bad is happening, but don't equate positive with good and negative with bad. Positive just means you're adding something, and negative means you're taking it away. And then finally, extinction, is the absence of reinforcement. And so it's when you work to get the individual to continue the behavior without receiving that reward or having that negative reinforcement or anything like that. And so the example they give, again, was with the temper tantrum, is that if the parent ignores the tantrum and doesn't give the attention that the child's seeking, that the tantrum should decrease. Now, of course, with parenting, the temper tantrums are going to increase before they decrease, and you got to stand firm on that, or you end up reinforcing it. And there's a lot that goes into like what kind of reinforcement is best, and there's different kinds of reinforcement. Like every time the the pigeon hits the button was a famous experiment, right? So every time the pigeon hits the button, they get a treat. And so they're going to learn to hit that button to get the treat. Well, there's intermittent or ratio reinforcement. So like every 5th time the pigeon hits a button, they get a treat. So the pigeon will know I need to hit it 5 times to get the treat. Or it could be randomized, right? So like pigeon keeps hitting that button, it doesn't know when the reward's going to come out, but it knows at some point there's going to be a reward. And that's actually the hardest to do extinction with. And so when you think of, and I like to kind of equate this for all behaviors, but it sort of makes sense. An analogy that I learned at some point was, you know, with say a snack machine or a soda machine, you expect to put money in there and get your snack or your soda. And so you have a good idea that there's going to be this reward for your behavior. I put money in, I get this reward. If the snack machine or the soda machine doesn't give me my reward, I'm going to assume that it's broken. And so I'm going to end that behavior, right? So that's the withdrawal of positive reinforcement. I'm not going to put any more money in there because I know I'm not getting that reward anymore. Whereas when you think of like a slot machine at like a casino or whatever, you put money in it, you pull the handle or press the buttons or whatever. Sometimes money comes out, sometimes it doesn't, and you don't know how often that's going to happen. And so you might pull it, press the buttons, and nothing comes out. But you're more likely to put more money in than you would the soda machine, right? The soda machine, the snack machine's broken, it ate my money, because you know at some point there's going to be a payoff. And that is really hard to extinguish, because no matter how many times you don't get that reward, you're going to go, oh, it's the next one. Oh, it's the next one. It's coming next. That machine could never give a payout, but you're sort of convinced that it will because you know the intermittent reward system. That also sort of explains why gambling can be so hard, such a difficult behavior to change in individuals, right? Something that is really hard to get a person to stop. Well, one of the reasons, I should say. So anyway, that was my sidebar about operant behavior model. Okay, so we went over 2. The third is the social learning model. So this is Albert Bandura. So we talked about with the classical conditioning model, we have Pavlov is the big name. Operant behavior model is Skinner. This one, the social learning model, is Bandura. And so he stressed the importance of both environmental reinforcers and internal processes. So rewards cannot completely come from outside of ourselves. Like, how do we start engaging in behaviors where there is no obvious reward? And so he talks about modeling or observational learning. And so, you know, you think of a young child developing and growing and stuff, they're likely to kind of mimic or copy behaviors of their caregivers and people that they're around. And so essentially what he says is that people make a mental or cognitive image of behavior that can later be copied in physical behavior. And so simply we're going to do the things that we see, right? We're going to learn from our environments. And then the fourth one is the cognitive learning model. So this one, one of the big people is Meachenbaum, but there are others. Go a step further and emphasize the importance of the internal process of learning. They emphasize the importance of cognitive events that influence behavior, such as our own thoughts, how we talk to ourselves, mental images, self-evaluations, our feelings, our memories, our beliefs, and all of that stuff that is inside of us has an impact as well, which explains why some people in the same environment may behave very differently or react very differently, because we all have kind of our own internal processes. All right, so learning problem behavior, how does this happen? It gives some examples of that, and basically ways that, you know, we can kind of learn it through some of those different models and stuff. But behavioral explanations have been proposed and utilized in the treatment of a broad spectrum of issues like anxiety, passivity, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, criminal behavior, etc. A variety of behavioral treatments have been developed to deal with them, and a high level of treatment effectiveness has been reported. And so there's lots of ways that we can deal with that. The next section is representative behavioral treatment approaches. So what kind of interventions do we actually use in practice? And so based on those theories, what are the interventions? And so some include, they kind of break it down between individual and group. Okay, so the first is individual, systematic desensitization, right? And so this is when there's some kind of fear, and it works really well with specific phobias and stuff like that, kind of like the extinction process, right? So we're trying to get an individual to learn how to be calm in higher anxiety provoking situations. So they create a hierarchy of, least anxiety provoking all the way up to like the most anxiety provoking. They learn coping skills such as relaxation and all of that. And then they go through those very slowly. First they start to talk about it, imagine it, picture it in their heads, and then eventually take steps to get closer and closer to those anxiety provoking situations. They engage in it, use their coping skills. Once they see a success there, they move up the hierarchy and so on. And so it can take, a decent amount of time if you have a lot of things on that hierarchy, right? Or if they're really strongly ingrained in the individual. And so they also talk about using virtual reality therapy with this. So you don't have to actually get on an airplane. If that's your phobia, we can do a virtual reality session, and your therapist can be there with you. Another one is operant approaches to individual problems, so concerned with the effects of consequences of behavior on the environment. The treatment involves controlling the consequences of the behavior in an attempt to change that behavior. Through the control of consequences, or rewards, you can think of it as, the behavior can be modified. And so this talks about like specific behaviors and ways that you can engage in those reinforcements and punishments and things like that. Now, reinforcements are shown to have much greater effect than punishments. And so it's much better to offer rewards and things like that than punishments to individuals who break those behavioral rules. Next is cognitive behavioral approaches, which involves focusing on teaching clients to use problem solving and coping skills on their behavior and the reactions they elicit, their internal speech and what they say to themselves before, during, and following behaviors, and then the cognitive factors, their feelings, beliefs, and attitudes that give rise to the internal dialogue. And this is a much more complicated thing. There's a number of different cognitive behavioral approaches that are outside of the scope of this chapter and this little section here. But the next are group system focused programs. And so we talk about token economies, which are essentially like, we see desired behavior, we give a reward. So this could be like when the schools will give little tokens or like these little like fake dollars to students for positive behaviors. So some kind of reward system that happens, and they can collect them for things that that they really want to earn, little toys and prizes and things. Other group approaches could be cognitive behavioral approaches used in a group setting, and being able to kind of teach it to the group and discuss individual stuff and all of that within the group setting. And then finally, your chapter talks about the effectiveness of these strategies. And as I started off the chapter saying, is that there is a lot of empirical evidence to support the use of these interventions to help people to create and potentially maintain change. So the chapter ends with a summary, recommended readings, internet sites for additional information, and the activity from my helping lab if you choose to do that, or if you have access to it. And that is it for chapter 7. You will see a video from me again when we begin week and chapter 8. Thank you.